When two of the most composed figures in the British royal family appeared visibly shaken during what was supposed to be a routine appearance, the world took notice. Princess Anne and Catherine, both known for their unwavering poise under pressure, displayed a level of vulnerability that palace observers had rarely, if ever, witnessed. The subject that triggered this uncharacteristic display of emotion was Prince Louis, the youngest child of the Prince and Princess of Wales, and a boy who has become increasingly absent from the public narrative surrounding the royal family. The event itself was meant to be understated, a charitable engagement that would draw minimal attention from the press corps. There had been no formal announcement from the royal press office, no grand staging, and certainly no expectation of drama. A small documentary crew had been granted access to follow Princess Anne during her philanthropic activities, and Catherine's attendance had not been confirmed until mere hours before. Yet the atmosphere shifted dramatically the moment conversation turned toward the young prince. Those present described a sudden heaviness in the room, an almost palpable tension that seemed to freeze everyone in place. Princess Anne, a woman whose decades of royal service have been defined by her directness and emotional control, reportedly stopped speaking mid-sentence. Catherine reached for a glass of water but found herself unable to lift it. The silence stretched uncomfortably as both women appeared to struggle with something deeply personal and profoundly distressing. Then, without warning, the carefully maintained composure cracked. Anne lowered her head, her shoulders trembling slightly. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, and when she finally managed to speak, her voice broke as she said words that would later be repeated in countless reports. "There's so much they don't know." The response from royal staff was immediate and telling. Aides moved quickly to intervene, attempting to shield cameras and speaking urgently into communication devices. The feed was shut down within seconds, but not before those brief moments of unguarded emotion had been captured. The small audience that witnessed the exchange sat in stunned silence, uncertain whether they had just seen something genuinely spontaneous in an institution famous for its carefully choreographed public image. Back within palace walls, the reaction bordered on panic. A crisis meeting was assembled with unusual speed, and protocols typically reserved for major scandals were activated. Yet the most revealing aspect of the palace's response was not what they released, but what they withheld. Sources suggest that a carefully prepared joint statement from both Anne and Catherine had been drafted days prior to the event, presumably intended to address growing speculation about Prince Louis's prolonged absence from royal life. That statement, however, never reached the public. Reports indicate that King Charles personally intervened, instructing the communications team to delay any release indefinitely. No explanation was provided for this decision, and the only public acknowledgement came in the form of a deliberately vague press release describing the event as emotionally charged and deeply personal. This carefully neutral language did little to quell the growing curiosity. Instead, it seemed to amplify speculation across social media platforms, where footage from the event quickly circulated despite palace efforts to contain it. The palace's attempt to make the incident disappear only drew more attention to it. Inside royal households, staff members spoke in hushed tones about tearful conversations and tense meetings behind closed doors. What became most unsettling to observers was not the breakdown itself, but the institutional response, a wall of silence where explanation might have provided clarity. Understanding the full context requires looking back over recent months and years. Prince Louis, once a lively presence during the occasional public appearance, had gradually faded from view. His absence, initially subtle enough to avoid widespread notice, had become increasingly impossible to ignore. Months had passed without a single photographed appearance, no casual family outings, no official portraits, not even the customary school photographs that other royal children routinely participated in. It was as though the youngest Wales child had been quietly erased from the royal narrative. Within palace circles, theories abounded. Some speculated about health concerns, while others suggested an overprotective response to media scrutiny. But beneath these surface explanations, staff members closer to the family began noticing more troubling patterns. The boy who had once been described as spirited and engaging had become withdrawn. Those who encountered him in palace corridors noted a change in his demeanor, a quietness that seemed unnatural for a child his age. Educators reportedly raised concerns about his emotional state, with at least one noting that he appeared exhausted in ways that went beyond normal childhood fatigue. These observations, however, were not welcomed with open discussion. They were documented, then effectively buried within internal records. Medical professionals were consulted, though always under conditions of strict confidentiality. Whatever findings emerged from these consultations remained locked away in sealed reports that even senior palace staff were instructed not to discuss. Catherine, whose protective instincts regarding her children have always been evident, began to withdraw from public life herself. Engagements were cancelled, interviews declined, and her availability to even friendly media outlets diminished significantly. Initially framed as a desire for increased family privacy, it became clear to those watching closely that something more serious was being shielded from view. Catherine reportedly resisted recommendations from palace-appointed specialists, instead seeking out experts through private channels, operating under pseudonyms to prevent any information from reaching the press. Even her closest confidants noticed the toll this was taking. She appeared exhausted, emotionally strained, and increasingly guarded in conversations. The woman known for her warmth and accessibility had begun building walls, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. This is when Princess Anne became more directly involved. Known for her practical approach and her ability to cut through royal pretense, Anne began making unannounced visits to Kensington Palace. What she witnessed during these visits apparently disturbed her deeply. While the bond between Catherine and Louis remained intact, it was strained by worry and by a shared sense of helplessness that no amount of privilege or position could alleviate. Sources describe long conversations between the two women in palace gardens, speaking in tones too low for others to hear, reviewing handwritten notes and private documents. From these conversations emerged what some palace insiders began calling a decision pact. The exact nature of this agreement remains unclear, but its effects rippled through every level of the royal household. Some believe Anne advised Catherine to keep Louis away from all royal functions indefinitely, removing him entirely from public obligations. Others suggest the pact involved a commitment to confront the monarchy's leadership directly if Louis's situation was ever exploited or mischaracterized for public relations purposes. There are even suggestions that Anne threatened to step back from her own royal duties if forced to maintain silence about what she was witnessing. Throughout all of this, medical professionals involved in Louis's care have maintained absolute silence. Not a single official statement has been issued regarding his condition or needs. Requests for comment from both media outlets and concerned observers have been met with cold refusal. Whatever is being protected within the walls of Kensington Palace carries enough weight to override even standard royal protocol, which typically allows for at least minimal acknowledgement of public concern. As the emotional toll on both Catherine and Anne continued to mount, the questions surrounding Prince Louis grew louder and more insistent. This was no longer a matter of idle speculation or tabloid gossip. The visible distress of two senior royal figures, combined with months of unexplained absence, had created a situation that demanded answers. The palace's traditional strategy of waiting for public interest to fade was failing. The silence that had once been maintained as protective was now being interpreted as evasive, perhaps even callous. And so the stage was set for what would become one of the most significant crises the modern monarchy has faced, not because of scandal or indiscretion, but because at its center was a child and two women who could no longer bear the weight of secrets they had been expected to keep. The tension that had been building within palace walls finally erupted when Princess Anne made a decision that went against every instinct of royal discretion she had cultivated over decades of service. In the middle of the night, she arrived unannounced at Clarence's house, demanding an immediate audience with her brother, King Charles. Those who witnessed her arrival described her demeanor as unlike anything they had seen before. The woman known for her unshakable composure appeared visibly agitated, her hands trembling as she insisted on speaking with the king without delay. The meeting that followed was unprecedented in its intimacy and its urgency. No advisors were summoned, no press secretaries briefed, no private secretaries present to take notes. For over an hour, the two siblings remained behind closed doors, and when the king emerged, those closest to him noted an expression they described as haunted. Anne had apparently opened the conversation with words that cut through any possibility of diplomatic deflection. She told her brother that they were losing Louis, that the child was slipping through the cracks of an institution too concerned with appearance to notice the quiet suffering happening within its own walls. According to sources with knowledge of the conversation, Anne did not speak in generalities or hypotheticals. She provided specific examples of concerning behavior, of emotional instability, of a child becoming increasingly detached from those around him. She made clear her belief that Prince Louis, despite being surrounded by every resource the monarchy could provide, was being fundamentally failed by the very system meant to protect him. And the responsibility for this failure, she stated directly, rested with the crown itself. King Charles's response apparently disappointed Anne deeply. While he listened to her concerns, his focus repeatedly drifted toward matters of public perception and media management. He raised questions about how any acknowledgement might be interpreted by the press, about the risk of information leaking, about the potential for misunderstanding. To Anne, this represented exactly the problem she was trying to highlight, a prioritization of image over genuine intervention. She reminded him, with emotion evident in her voice, that the institution had once allowed silence to contribute to Diana's tragedy. They had promised themselves, promised the public, that such failures would never be repeated. What happened next marked a fundamental break in royal protocol. Anne, who had spent her entire life avoiding media manipulation and publicity seeking, informed her brother that if the palace continued to delay meaningful action, she would speak publicly, not as a princess bound by institutional loyalty, but as an aunt who refused to watch a child suffer. Behind a facade of normalcy, she made clear that she would find ways to make her concerns known, whether through carefully worded remarks during charitable appearances, through trusted intermediaries, or through other channels if necessary. This was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. The king's silence in response told Anne everything she needed to know. As she left Clarence's house that night, her footsteps echoing through empty corridors, she understood that the battle she had hoped to avoid had become inevitable. But before any further action could be taken within the family, another development shifted the entire narrative in an unexpected direction. Prince Harry, who had spent years distancing himself from the institution and building a life outside its constraints, suddenly broke his public silence on the matter. On a rarely used social media account, he posted a single sentence against a stark black background. The words were cryptic but unmistakable in their implication. "It's always the youngest they forget, the boy no one's watching." No names were mentioned, no specific situations referenced, yet everyone understood exactly whom he meant and what he was suggesting. The timing of Harry's statement could not have been coincidental. It came mere days after fragments of the footage showing Anne and Catherine's emotional moment had begun circulating online, and during a period when both women had gone completely silent in their public roles. Harry was reaching back into a family he had fought to separate himself from, not to attack or criticize, but to sound an alarm. Within 24 hours, a spokesperson released a statement on his behalf that removed any ambiguity. It acknowledged that Harry understood what it meant to grow up feeling unseen and unheard, that he recognized patterns repeating themselves, and that he was speaking not as a prince but as someone who knew the cost of institutional indifference. For the first time since the crisis began, Prince Louis was mentioned by name in a statement from a member of the royal family. The impact was immediate and profound. Public sentiment, which had been divided between curiosity and concern, shifted dramatically toward protective outrage. The narrative that had painted Harry as a disloyal outsider began to fracture as people reconsidered whether his criticisms of the institution might have been more justified than previously believed. Former palace staff members, emboldened by this public acknowledgement, began speaking off the record about their own observations and concerns. The palace found itself in an impossible position. The emotional credibility of Anne and Catherine, combined with Harry's pointed intervention, had created a groundswell of public demand for transparency that could not be ignored or deflected. Behind palace walls, the scramble to formulate an appropriate response bordered on chaos. King Charles and Queen Camilla abruptly cancelled a high-profile engagement that had been scheduled months in advance, offering no explanation and no alternative date. Those close to the king described him as visibly shaken by the intensity of public reaction and the growing perception that the monarchy was prioritizing its reputation over the well-being of a child. Yet even as pressure mounted, the most damaging revelation was still to come. A former nanny, who had served in the Wales household during a critical period, had kept a detailed journal of her experiences. These private writings, never intended for public consumption, contained observations that painted a deeply troubling picture of Prince Louis's daily reality. The journal made repeated references to something the child called the Red Room, a place he appeared to fear intensely. The nanny documented instances of the boy avoiding certain corridors, growing pale at mentions of specific locations, and waking from nightmares pleading not to be sent back there. More concerning were her descriptions of extended isolation of a child whose world seemed to be contracting rather than expanding, of long stretches of unnatural silence. The nanny had attempted to raise these concerns through proper channels, requesting reassignment twice due to the emotional toll of witnessing what she described as a child disappearing into himself. Both requests were denied. Among her papers was an undelivered letter addressed to Catherine, its message stark and desperate. In it she pleaded for more direct intervention, noting that Louis no longer cried or showed typical signs of distress, but instead seemed to be vanishing internally, withdrawing to a place no one could reach. When details of this journal began emerging, the nature of the conversation changed entirely. This was no longer speculation or interpretation. This was documented observation from someone who had been present, who had watched the situation unfold, and who had tried unsuccessfully to prompt action. The mystery of the Red Room, became a focal point of intense public interest, with theories ranging from the symbolic to the literal. Former palace staff weighed in with conflicting accounts, some dismissing it as a child's imagination, others insisting there was more to the story than had been acknowledged. Faced with mounting evidence and relentless public pressure, the palace was forced into a position it had desperately tried to avoid. In an extraordinary departure from protocol, Princess Anne and Catherine appeared together in a broadcast that was stripped of all royal pageantry. No grand setting, no formal insignia, just two women sitting close together, the weight of months of silence evident in their expressions. Anne spoke first, establishing immediately that this was not about titles or protocol, but about a child who needed help and had not received it adequately. Then Catherine began to speak, and what followed was a level of candor unprecedented in modern royal communications. She revealed that Louis had been diagnosed with a condition requiring intensive emotional support, and that attempts to address it properly had been met with institutional resistance at multiple levels. Professional recommendations had been minimized or ignored. Her own concerns had been dismissed as maternal overreaction. She had been encouraged, even pressured, to maintain public appearances while privately managing a crisis that was overwhelming their family. Her voice broke as she described being told to smile for cameras while everything behind those images was fracturing. There was no attempt to soften the truth or preserve the institution's image. Catherine spoke directly to other families who might be watching, urging them not to wait, not to let concerns be dismissed, to speak until someone listened. Anne sat beside her in silent support, a united front built not on royal solidarity, but on shared heartbreak and determination. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in public perception of the monarchy. The institution had cracked open, not through scandal, but through an honest acknowledgement of failure. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media filled with personal stories from families facing similar struggles. Mental health professionals and child welfare advocates praised the courage required to speak so openly. International media outlets shifted their coverage from speculation to empathy. Yet notably absent from this wave of response was any statement from King Charles. He remained at Sandringham, watching but not participating, offering no public comment or gesture of support. His silence continued even as pressure mounted for some form of royal unity. And then, 72 hours after the broadcast, an official decree was issued. Prince Louis would no longer participate in any future royal engagements. The stated reason was brief and clinical: for his protection. To outside observers, this might have seemed like a reasonable response, a child being shielded from public pressure. But those within the inner circle understood the true nature of the decision. This was not protection. This was removal, a quiet exile dressed in the language of concern. Catherine was reportedly informed of this decision after it had already been made, without her input or consultation. Her reaction was telling in its restraint. She simply stood, acknowledged the information with a single nod, and left the room. Later, staff found her alone in the palace gardens, tears streaming down her face. These were not tears of shock, but of betrayal, not just by an institution, but by a family that had failed to stand beside her when it mattered most. William's role in this decision created perhaps the deepest wound. He had been present during discussions but had offered no opposition to the decree. Those close to him suggest he believed his silence would help preserve stability, that avoiding conflict with his father was the responsible path for a future king. But for Catherine, that silence represented an abandonment of everything they had supposedly built together. She had stood before the world, exposed and vulnerable, and the man who should have fought beside her had chosen caution instead. Princess Anne's response was characteristically direct. She confronted the king in his private study, demanding an explanation for a decision that seemed to punish a child for the institution's failures. What she received instead was a prepared statement, delivered through an aide, about acting in everyone's best interest. Anne's reply was simple but devastating. She asked whose best interest was actually being served, because it certainly was not Louis's. Before leaving, she made her position unmistakable. If the monarchy could not protect its most vulnerable members, then it did not deserve her continued service. The public reaction split along predictable lines. Some viewed the decree as necessary, a difficult but appropriate step to remove a struggling child from public scrutiny. Others saw it as precisely what it felt like: institutional abandonment dressed as protection. The comparisons to Diana's treatment decades earlier were inevitable and damaging. The monarchy that had promised to learn from past mistakes appeared to be repeating them in slow motion, and so the royal family found itself fractured in full view of the world. The damage was not hidden behind carefully managed statements or diplomatic silence. It was visible, undeniable, and generational. The future of the institution itself seemed less certain than at any point in recent memory, not because of scandal or controversy, but because when faced with a choice between image and integrity, between protocol and protection, The crown had chosen wrong. Prince Louis remained out of sight, his well-being still uncertain, his future unclear, and the questions about what happened and why continued to echo unanswered through palace halls and public consciousness alike.